Hello and welcome to the Deep Side channel, and this is a book review for Sharks, Fights and Motorbikes When It Rains in Egypt. I don't know about you, but your biggest obstacle on the way to work or in the workplace might just be something like a late train, or you're caught in the traffic, or it's raining. It was a little bit different for me in Sharm el-Sheikh in the Red Sea back in 2010 and 11, when we had to deal with multiple shark attacks and a people's revolution. You could say it was a bad day at the office. These events made international headlines, and I really didn't want to write this book because I like a laugh. I like writing interesting, entertaining, funny stories about life, diving, traveling. And every time I attempt to do that, something really big and horrible happens. And following Lost Wives Saw Barracuda, which was largely a positive book, and the incident in that book, then I really was beginning to get quite upset with this string of disasters, I think is the only word. Whilst the news is bad, the inspiration of people, the resilience they develop, the how can we put it, the absolute will to succeed in the face of this awful adversity is worth a book in itself, and that's what really comes across in Sharks, Fights and Motorbikes. When it's a resort town, a holiday town, they are kind of dressed up as paradise, and I wouldn't say dressed up, but it's incredible diving, the weather's good, the scenery is good. It is in its way a paradise, but when there's problems there, it seems to be magnified. It seems to be 10 times worse than, say, a normal city because, oh, you shouldn't have trouble in paradise. It's always lovely and the sky's blue and everybody's happy and smiling and that's it. But occasionally real life rears its ugly head and dealt us two back-to-back double whammies. And there was more. I went to work one day and my task that particular morning was to tell a woman who was a beginner learn to dive student that her course was cancelled because that week there'd been 4 shark attacks in the region, including 1 death, and everything was off limits. And I remember her sitting there full of joy with her training manual and her happy look as if I'd been waiting to do this all my life, and I had to tell her it wasn't going to happen. And there was a television program back in the UK called Call My Bluff. And the idea was you have to tell somebody an outrageous story. Some of them are true, some of them weren't. And they hold a sign up that says true or bluff. And I told her and she looked at me and smiled and said, very good. She said, very, very good. Bit bad taste, but yeah, I nearly fell for that. And I said, I'm very sorry, but it's absolutely true. And that was a typical reaction. It was just disbelief. The only way anyone's ever going to come back or deal with that, do what they should have done in the first place, is if there is total and 100% closure of this matter. That will only occur with a full investigation, a total understanding of why that's happened, and remedies put in place that it just doesn't happen again. And the first attack was bad enough, but it was only one, and whilst they're exceptionally rare, they are usually explained by silly behaviour, maybe somebody doing illegal feeding or something, but they were very rare and way out of prying eyes. But when you have 4 in the space of a few days all along this popular coastal reef, attacking people who were doing nothing wrong. These people were not feeding or chumming or doing anything silly. They were just going about their business. This is what made it so horrific. And this made headlines all over the world. And what was really upsetting was that this was the town we lived. I'm just going to read some out. You had the Sun saying, Red Sea Jaws strikes again. The Daily Mail, blood in the water in Sharm el-Sheikh. The Telegraph, tourist killed in 4th shark attack in a week. Thanks. I feel a Pharrell Williams song coming on. So there I was as a working diving instructor and a writer. I was also a journalist for the local magazine. And I got invited up to Cairo to appear on Nile TV, the breakfast show, to be interviewed by people who simply wanted to know what was going on. I didn't really have any answers, and I don't think anybody did. And at the time, they invited the shark experts from the States and other countries because they wanted to solve this problem as quick as possible. They wanted to understand it. And along came George Burgess. He was head of the Shark Trust, and he led a team to conduct an extensive investigation. The reasons are still being speculated today, but in the book we talk about the conclusions of that, and it was attributable down to the exceptionally warm weather for December, the overfishing in the Red Sea, which was removing the natural food stock, and also the passing ship, an Australian cargo ship, threw 35 dead sheep over the side, right in the area of diving and swimming. And of course, they also found out that there was some baiting going on. Now, whilst that's bad news, it is good news in that it's solvable, which it eventually was, and it returned to normal. But at that particular moment, we had to deal with it. That was the end of December, and just as we're slowly putting that horrible event behind us, then there was a date beginning to appear in conversations. It was on the tip of everybody's tongue. They talked about the 25th of January 2011 as a day of protest or a day of rage or a gatherings. And I've seen this before. They come and go, and at best it's kind of, okay chaps, you've had your fun, now move along, point taken. And it's all over in a few minutes. And this was a country where protests weren't allowed. However, the inklings of unrest were already unfolding in other countries. Tunisia was the first because they had an incident there, and it went all the way. So there was no smoke without fire here. 25th of January came. The thousands of protesters were gathering in Tahrir Square in Cairo, and they were serious. They meant business, and it ran on for several days. You had in Sharm el-Sheikh a very busy town, so despite previous other events, its strength is that it always bounces back, and it gets on with it. And you could argue that we've been toughened up by so many incidents out there that we got not just thick skin, but we have the ability to and the resolve to deal with it. It's I said in the previous review about the incidents in Lost Wives or Barracuda, you develop the resilience. It's in you. It's there when you want it. But we didn't want it, and we had to deal with it. So all of the guests and students out at the time, they were doing their diving activities. They had one eye on the news and didn't look too serious. It's all up the road, which was a very big road. It was Cairo is 550 kilometers from Sharm, and it didn't really get more than the odd glance until it started to stretch a few days, and then it got quite serious. And we were already struggling trying to find patches of water and dive sites that were, safe. The findings of the Shark Trust were good. They put in lots of new procedures. And then it all kicked off again, and it kicked off so badly that all the tour operators pulled all the flights. They said, if you want to leave, we're laying on these flights, and you've got to be on that. And otherwise, that's it. So, how did we deal with that? Back to back. A few months earlier, a diving pal of mine, a French photographer by the name of Jan Vautrin, came up with a very good idea to become the first people to conduct a long-distance scuba diving and motorcycling journey. And we had this planned for several countries, but we decided to instead do the entire country of Egypt. So sharks, fights and motorbikes. This is the motorbike side, because we wanted to show people that the country was safe, that the unrest was limited to this particular action in Cairo, although it was spreading to other areas, and show Egypt for all its splendor. If you mention Egypt to certain people, they will obviously think of the pyramids and Luxor and Cairo. There's so much more to it. The wilderness of the national parks and the desert, because the majority of the country is a desert. You have the Sinai, you have the Egyptian mainland. We did 5,000 kilometers covering the entire country, and sadly the place was empty. It was double-edged swords. Like kids in a candy shop, we got the place to ourselves. We're riding these 1,000cc KTM motorcycles all over the country, and everybody was very, very welcoming. So this was a big section of the book, and like some of my other books, there are threads. We come and go with the sharks and the investigations. We come and go with the revolutions. We come and go on a different thread with the motorcycle journey, which took us all around the coastal areas, the Sinai, the northern Mediterranean, which was spectacular. We got to dive the sunken city of Alexandria, and there's a very good chapter about this and why it's sunken, all of that region where it collapsed into the sea as far over as Libya, all the way across Egypt 2,000 years ago. We visit the war graves of El Alamein, which was very humbling and moving. We also head down the Nile Delta, the beautiful lush fields and farms, all with their agriculture and their produce. And everywhere we went, we were made very, very welcome. And this is the nature of the Egyptian people. It's their nature anyway, but of course, being empty at the time because of the unrest, they were particularly grateful to see us and tell their stories. We got to to hear about what they think of what's going on. The shark attacks, this was now not old news, but it was replaced by a much bigger event nationally, and we learnt a lot. We don't think that any other individuals travel so extensively within the country in that short space of time at that period. So we had a really good bird's eye view and a real fly on the wall look at what was going on in the country. How did the people of Sharm el-Sheikh respond? They're very resilient, so they dug deep, and there was something of a fitness craze going on at the time, and it resulted in the first ever rugby football match being played in the Sinai, and that's fully sanctioned from the Rugby Football Union. The idea was born by some expats who used to play in the army and the police, and they got us rag-bag collection of instructors together and whipped us into shape. The average age of the team was 40, and it was a bit like one of those war movies where they get loads of aging mercenaries together to carry out some sort of daring raid or impossible mission. And months later, we were all fit and polished and whipped into shape, and we had our first game. We actually went on to beat Cairo Rugby Football Club and one of the leading Alexandria teams. And that was a record, but unfortunately it wasn't the only thing that got broken, because during that time I had a bit of a fight with the floor and came second and actually snapped the bone in my left wrist. So a lot of the book, Sharks, Fights and Motorbikes, is actually written with just one hand. I used this one to press the shift and control button, not quite like Stephen Hawking's, but it was very limiting. So that was yet another obstacle in my quest to get in the water and teach people to dive and take them out on guided trips. And I was unfortunately out the water for 4 months, but a very good opportunity to write this all down. As the arm healed and the plaster became like an old friend, it happened all again. There was no government for quite some time because, of course, when you bring down a powerhouse like Egypt with a population of around 90 million and a GDP of billions and a huge army and lots of resources and industry. You don't just kind of hand the keys to a caretaker manager and have a few leaving drinks and it's all over. It's a major vacuum. And at the time, the army had taken control, and the idea was to have new elections. So in the book, we talk about how that process went on, and also what happens in a country with, I wouldn't say no government, but there was a temporary government. And it was very unsettling. There was not many people knew in which direction it would go. And how were the new police and army in relation to the old one? Of course, they're the same, but when it all changes at the top, the trickle-down effect, how would they feel now that everything's changed for them? So along came eventually the new president, Morsi, and he ran for a while. The elections seemed fair enough. It was relatively close, and he got into power. And then after a few months, it all started to go horribly wrong again. He had the unenviable distinction of having the largest protest against one individual in the history of mankind. And this was verified by Google Earth, who actually was able to calculate from images about how many people were estimated to be on the streets. And it turned out to be something like 33 million, which was quite spectacular. This time, it was all a very relatively friendly affair up until a point, because everybody was out on the streets again. There was this, the now President General Sisi was head of the military at the time, so he issued him with an ultimatum: sort this out, get the people back on side, and it didn't happen. And then you had this huge outpouring of it's the most unusual protest I've ever seen. I mean, we've had a period of relative peace here in the UK for many, many years. My parents were, they endured the Second World War, and whilst we've had conflicts, I don't recall being in a country where unrest has happened in that country at that time. And here it was again. It was all up in Cairo last time and on TV, and of course we followed it, but this time it was everywhere, and Sharm el-Sheikh was absolutely buzzing. Everybody jumped into their cars on rooftops that are hanging out of building windows. They all had their flags and car horns and hooters and squeakers and buzzers, and it was as if it was one big carnival. It wasn't really a protest, it was a celebration that he'd already gone, even though he hadn't gone. It was that they were that optimistic. And everybody had their little red cards, like a football referee, as if to say off, which was probably a very polite way of saying something else. And they were all over Sharm, and I jumped in the car with my broken arm. Somebody else was driving. And I wanted to be there and witness it, and not gawp at it. This was a real country in crisis. It was really going on, and it was their battle. I'm not a tourist there. I was not a visitor. I was a resident. It's not quite the same, but it does give you an interest in that place that provides your home and your livelihood. You want to get close, but not too close. You want to be there and witness it. I didn't really know how I felt about it all, other than, well, you better go and see history one way or the other. And of course, these things can go horribly wrong, so it was a good chance to, excuse me, one had to be vigilant and, keep an eye on it. I never saw any signs of that. It was from the outset a huge outpouring of, I don't know, something. They were just happy. They were letting fireworks off and dancing, playing instruments. There were still some tourists there. And what was really amusing was they'd probably been told to stay in the hotel and watch out, and it's all kicking off. And I can imagine their relatives back home thinking, oh no, how are they getting on out there? And they went from kind of peering behind the hotel windows to venturing out into the forecourt to, I think, you know, the next time I saw them, an hour later, they were all doing the conga down the high street. There was, you know, a policeman behind them, and then a couple of taxi drivers in front, and it was everybody. It seemed like the whole country was against this individual. It was quite spectacular. Things moved on pretty quickly after that, and the party kind of died down a bit, and then it was back to normal life, whatever that was. So there were so many things going on. This book covers the lot. You will read about every single event, and it was right on our doorstep. It's a very, very positive and inspiring book, and the real drive of the Egyptian people comes across, the real resilience of the Sharm el-Sheikh community. So you have many books in one here. The shark attacks, the revolution, the bike trip. There's something for the rugby fans too, because this story is quite incredible, that you go from nothing to something and break records. Hope you really enjoy the book. Hope you like the video, and looking forward to seeing you in the next one.